Our next speaker is Jay Newton-Small. She's the Washington correspondent for Time, the author of Broad Influence: How Women Are Changing the Way America Works. She writes about everything from Washington politics to foreign policy and national trends, including conflicts in the Middle East, the earthquake in Haiti, the November Paris attacks, and much, much more. After our Q&A, she is going to be signing her book in the cafeteria, and she'll be doing that through lunch. Please welcome Jay Newton-Small.
Hi, thanks so much to MCON for having me here. So my book grew out of a story that I wrote for Time magazine about 2.5 years ago about the women of the Senate coming together during the government shutdown to restart the negotiations to reopen the government when none of the men would talk to each other. I had a lot of interest in writing a book out of that episode, but it was honestly all of the women of the Senate were writing their own books and they didn't need one from me. But what interested me most about that episode was that it was the first time the Senate was 20% women, and they ended up having a huge impact. They actually ended up producing 75% of the legislation that passed that session, which was pretty amazing. As someone who's covered the Senate for the better part of 15 years, you could really tangibly feel the difference of the way the Senate was being run at that point. And so I had a huge response to that story. I got more letters from that particular story than any other story I'd ever written for Time, which includes 2 cover stories on Sarah Palin, so that's telling you something. But a lot of the letters that I wrote were from women saying that they were experiencing the same thing that the women of the Senate were experiencing, that they were reaching this kind of critical mass tipping point in their workplaces. And so there was a woman from the Navy who wrote to me about how all Navy ships required at least 20% women on the ships with a goal of 25% women, and that was led by officers who came in first and paved the way so that men got used to taking orders from women, respecting women before the rank and file came in. And how the Navy had spent decades coming to this sort of formula with trial and error. So the Supreme Court had actually required the Navy to integrate in 1973, and at first they put in 1 woman, and then 2 women, then a handful of women, and they realized it was kind of a disaster for everybody involved until they struck upon the idea of critical mass. And then it really began to work, and they understood that you needed critical mass for this work situation to become sort of normalized and women to just be accepted and be part of the team in the way they were. I had a woman from New York who wrote to me about the 30% Club, which is a group that tries to get 30% women on corporate boards. And they had done all this amazing research that showed that when you have 30% women on a board, the board completely changes, and the company's whole stance changes in the way their company is run. So companies are 26% more efficient. They have to restate their earnings 55% less, and they are 45% more profitable. Who would not want that, right? So there was this amazing business case to have more women on boards that wasn't just this sort of luxury of this kind of, oh, look, we bring women, this is a PR thing. It was an actual case on why you should do this. So I decided to write a book collecting all of the ways in which women were reaching critical mass, this quote-unquote critical mass in the workforce, and then all the ways where they were not. And so critical mass is an interesting concept. It actually comes from science. It's the point in which a chain reaction can no longer be stopped. So if you think of it in a nuclear reaction, it's the point at which you can no longer stop the bomb from going boom. But so critical mass has been used in sociology for years. For example, when they desegregated schools in the South, Congress required a quote-unquote critical mass of 20% of minority students in all the schools because otherwise it just didn't really work. For women, critical mass means somewhere between 20 and 30%. And that's a number that changes depending on the makeup of the institution. So, and then in the case of Congress, you had a lot of chairwomen who were chairing committees in the Senate, so they actually controlled 11 of the 20 committees that session, which is why they ended up producing so much legislation and why they only needed 20% of the overall number of women. But when you have less critical actors, you actually need more overall women. So one of the cool things that I found, or one of the interesting things I found in doing this research, was that the government is actually reaching critical mass in all 3 branches right now. So 20% of Congress, 30% of the administration in terms of upper-level civil service and political appointees, and 36% of the federal bench are now women, including 40% of state judges. So we've made a lot of progress there. We've actually fallen behind in the private sector. So in the last decade, the private sector has remained stuck at 17% corporate board representation and 20% representation in the executive suite workforce. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So I was curious, why is the public sector doing better? Well, first of all, public sector jobs tend to pay less, so there's a lot less competition for women to go into them. 2, women tend to self-select. They want to, if they're going to miss their kids' soccer games, if they're going to not be able to tuck their kids in at night, then they want to be doing it for what they feel is making the world a better place for those kids. 3, the unions in the public sector are much stronger. So when women left their jobs to have kids, their jobs were still there when they came back. 4, the pipeline was actually a lot better. So New Hampshire, one of my favorite states in the nation, not just because they vote early, is the most representative democracy in the nation. So its lower house representatives has 400 members that represent 3 million people. So it's a tiny leap from running from your school board to running for your state legislature. You're literally representing like 100 more people. And so a lot of women go into this job, and it's a part-time job like the state legislatures are in 36 states in the nation. And as your kids get older, you can then run for higher office, start chairing committees. And in New Hampshire, this has led to, in the last 5 years alone, not just the governor, the lieutenant governor, the AG, half the state senate, and the entire congressional delegation being women. But the number one reason, the number one reason why women do better in the public sector than the private sector is because they have different bosses. So in the private sector, it's mostly white men who promote you. In the public sector, it's mostly women who vote for you. Women make up 53% of the electorate, and in presidential elections, they tend to vote on average 10% more than men do. Women have swung every election since Ronald Reagan. So in order to win an election, you have to appeal to women. You have to be seen appointing women, promoting women, supporting their candidacies, which is why we have so many women in our government. By far, the hardest glass ceiling to break was actually executive office, which is really interesting. All the talents that help women get elected to legislatures or boards, the perception, and all women are not unilateral, but the perception that they are better at win-win scenarios and consensus building and bringing people together helps them get elected to these roles. But it actually hurts them when they're running for executive office. And that is the most important office for women, because it's with executives that you can really advance and sort of supercharge women's participation in the workforce. For example, Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives almost single-handedly increased female representation from 19% of her caucus to 36% of her caucus. So you need those CEOs, those sort of executives in office. And yet we have so few of them. In the private sector, only 5.1% of women are CEOs of Fortune 1000 companies. Only 6 of our nation's 50 governors, and only 17% of our mayors are women. And obviously, until recently, basically this week or last week, we've never had a female nominee of either major party in the government. So it's such a tough ceiling to break, because in order to win an elective office or be appointed to an executive office, you have to prove that you're capable. Women face a totally different test than men do. So in running for legislatures, you don't have to prove that you're capable. You just have to, prove that. Well, I mean, to some degree, you have to prove you're capable, but you don't have the same barrier of capability proof that you do for an executive office. For example, women running for the presidency, they have to prove that they can be a commander-in-chief. Same thing for a governor in terms of running a National Guard, or a mayor in terms of running a police force. And you have to show you're tough enough and not so emotional that you're going to, have your finger on the button at that time of the month and nuke Russia. So, which is honestly a thing that people talked about with early female politicians running for president. So, in order to show that you're tough, that you have to, in order to show that you're capable, most women have to show they're tough, but they also have to still remain likable, which is a really, really hard needle to thread, because it's very easily, you can cross right over to bitch. And you see that, I think, this time around. So in the first sort of times that women run for executive office as governors that I've interviewed for my book, they said they really had to run as men. They sort of had to prove that they were tough, they had to prove they were capable, and they had to be serious and sober, and they could, but the second time they ran for executive office, they could be much more themselves. They could run as women, they could be more authentically themselves, and I think you see this a little bit with Hillary's candidacy right now, right? Like last time when I covered her in 2008, she ran very much as a man. This time around in 2016, her entire platform is running as a woman. Like her biggest applause line in any of her speeches these days is about equal pay. And when I interviewed her for the book, she did talk about how different it was running in 2008 versus 2016, but she still felt that she faced subtle sexisms. And I think you saw this also in the campaign trail this time around, where her biggest problem was being likable, right? Like more likable than, say, Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, although he's not that liked either in terms of polling. But her challenge was, for young voters and particularly young women, was to be liked enough to be voted for. And while Bernie Sanders could yell at you for 40 minutes, Hillary Clinton yelling at you, everyone was like, oh my God, why is mom screaming at me? So to wrap it up, since I'm almost out of time, one of the things that I was most excited about in this book is the idea that we are actually really not far away from parity, which I thought was really interesting. In my lifetime, I always thought, you know what, we're never gonna get to parity, and I was excited just to get to the idea of critical mass, that we only had to get to 20 or 30% to have our voices heard and make a difference. But actually, we are sort of close to parity. Women came into the workforce in the 1940s with Rosie the Riveter, because the economy demanded it. During World War II, if women hadn't brought in the crops, built the ships, built the planes, we would not have won that war and the economy would have collapsed. But it wasn't until the 1970s that all of the laws banning married women from working without their husband's permission were fully repealed. And it will be because of economic necessity that women will come fully into the workforce, and we're really close to that. By the year 2030, the baby boomer generation will have fully retired out of the workforce, and we will be short 26 million workers. Now, that's hard to imagine in this economy having just come out of the recession, but there's really only two ways to solve that shortfall. One, you bring in a ton of new immigration, which is really hard to imagine with this Congress. Or two, you bring women up to full employment. That almost completely solves the whole. That brings in 23 million new workers. And we already have the skills to do this. We already make up half of all college degrees and 60% of all graduate degrees. So we have the capability to do it, we're just not using those skills. But this is not going to happen naturally. It's something that will take the government pushing and encouraging the private sector to do this. Other countries have reached this cliff ahead of us. Europe, for example, is aged beyond us. Their solution was to impose quotas. Again, not very likely with this Congress. But there are examples like in UK and Canada who have the 30% Club, which is a public-private partnership, or in Australia, the aptly named Male Champions for Change, which challenges the male CEOs in the country to really bring in and report and show that they are promoting women. Those are examples of where we might go in this with the next presidency, because the next president, no matter whom he or she is, will have to deal with this coming demographic cliff, and will have to do something in order to really help bring women into the workforce. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time, a time we're right on the cusp of change, and you see that with the millennial generation coming up, and where they're really beginning to get involved with, with feminism. So as the millennial, and I'm a cusp. I'm in the upper end of the millennial generation, but as they've aged into the workforce and they've found that the assumed equality of the sexes, which is a hallmark of their generation, doesn't actually exist, they've become more and more activists. And so you see Taylor Swift with her girl posse demanding recognition of the Grammys, or Jennifer Lawrence asking for equal pay. But the key will be to bring that to the next level, right? To bring all of the workforce, all the women into the workforce, and not only achieve equal pay, but find ways to bring the women who are not participating fully into it. And that will be the challenge for the next president, which I think will be exciting to watch. And with that, I'm going to leave it with you.
Excellent. I feel empowered. But now what do we do? So, asking for equal pay, I think, is such an interesting thing, because, shouldn't we demand it? So what do you say to these young women here who need to understand how they can research to do that ask? What do you recommend that they do, but also who to emulate who's done it well?
So a lot of the thing about equal pay is just that women, it's not all of it, but some of it is that they're not confident enough to ask for it, right? And so in one of the chapters that I have, the first chapter, I looked at the women in the West Wing and how they'd already had parity, not parity, they'd already reached critical mass. They were at 39% of the West Wing, but they were not being heard. They were not being sort of listened to, and they were really frustrated. It got so bad that in November of 2009, they had this dinner with Barack Obama where they were like, "We are so frustrated. We hate this. We're not succeeding here." And Obama kind of was almost unsympathetic to them and was like, "You know what? The men are doing what the men need to do, and you guys just need to step it up." And
step it up, like be heard, or step up your work?
Step up to be heard. And I think, and he almost offhandedly recommended they start to get together. And they did. And because a lot of the women didn't know each other before coming into the White House, and it's not like you have a huge amount of time to socialize in these jobs. But they did actually start to make an effort to get to know each other. And they were really successful in forming a cabal amongst themselves. So they would, you know, every time they saw a woman being cut out of a meeting where that, you know, was relevant to their subject matter, they would text her and be like, hey, we're meeting in the Roosevelt room, come down.
Yeah.
Or if she couldn't make the meeting, they would say, hey, here's what happened, here's who you should follow up with. But I think, you know, and they had all these great recommendations to each other, you know, like, you know, 2-drink minimum in work situations, or 2-drink maximum, like, you know, stayed dancing, one-piece bathing suits, like, here's how you dress, here's what you should say in certain circumstances. But I think the biggest piece of advice they gave each other was to be confident. So many women will not speak out unless they have like 100% information, right? We always over-research things. And they don't really, they don't feel comfortable speaking. And in the White House, it's like drinking from a fire hose. Nobody has 100% information. You're functioning on at best 40% information. And men are totally cool with, like, you know, speaking up at like 25% information, and like,
or none.
or none. And, you know, like Carol Browner told me this great story about when she was in the cabinet and how she would spend days angsting over what she would say in cabinet meetings. And she then had this meeting with 2 of her male counterparts right before the cabinet meeting. And she was like, how long do you guys think about what you're going to say in the cabinet meetings? And the men were like, I don't know, like 5 minutes. Like, she was like, that's it, seriously? So, I mean, the women, I think, just realized that you have to get comfortable really quickly speaking on a hunch, you know, and just speaking out like what you think your best guess is, or what you think is the most important thing, and not feel like, because if you wait till you have 100% information, you're never going to speak in that situation, ever.
Right.
And I think a lot of it is just confidence, to be able to know that even if you don't have like every single fact and figure, just speak up and be heard.
Right. I think, you know, the idea of a boys' club, it's so second nature to men to kind of be in this group of men. And I think when we think of women in groups, we think of mean girls. And, you know, there's a leader, there's a follower, there's kind of a structure. So what do you recommend for women who want to not have a mean girls club, but an empowering group of women? How do you get them to structure themselves? Because we do like structure. We want to know kind of who's in charge, is it me, and how to step up.
So I think, I mean, for the Mean Girls thing certainly used to apply generationally. Like, there was this whole generation of women who first came up, and it was like, if there was going to be one, it was going to be them, right? And they had really sharp elbows. And that's where the whole Madeleine Albright, like, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women come from, because she came up in the next generation after that, and she was really talking about older women who were not helping her and her cohorts come up. She was not talking about younger women. But I think it's interesting in Washington, and you see it, like, we are the most successful city in America for women, right? And that's because we are, not only does the government help, you know, support women, or it's much easier for women to get jobs, but it's also because women here organize so much more than men do. It's like actually insane how much women organize in Washington. Like, I started to do this research project where I was looking at all the different groups, and it was like literally, you could be like, there was like the Republican opposition researcher women's.
It's very niche.
You know, like, it's like, you know, like
these are my people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like so random, and that's because we are a city that came out of grassroots organizing, right? So it's very second nature to us. Whereas in the private sector, it's very antithetical to what they do. It's sort of very forced, and it's like, you know, usually it's the CEO that says, "Hey, women, go like over there and have a drink, and like be together." And you're like, "Why am I doing this? This is useless." And I think that the grassroots organization piece of it, where it's like we are all in this together and we are stronger together than apart, really helps get rid of that kind of mean girl thing, and just the sense of like, if we don't help each other, then nobody's gonna help us, and if we don't help each other, we're actually gonna lag farther behind.
Do you think it's true that we're going to have a woman as either the president or the vice president? Do you think there's going to be a woman at that level? I mean, it's kind of hard to know. It's, you know, looking into the future. But
I mean, if you look at polling, I think if the election were today, it looks like Hillary would win. I mean, obviously you can't say, you know, we'll see. And we don't know who Trump might choose as his vice presidential nominee. It could be a woman as well.
So let's say today that one way or another there'll be a woman. So do you think that suddenly the dynamic is going to change, or is this kind of the watershed moment where we're going to see that major shift that we're waiting for?
I think things would change enormously. I mean, first of all, like, I mean, women born after the first female president are born into a world where there are no barriers, right? Like, where women have literally, you know, gotten through every glass ceiling you possibly could. I mean, let's say it's Hillary, and in this case, you know, I've interviewed Hillary for it. I interviewed Carly Fiorina as well, but Carly is not the nominee. But if Hillary, you know, since she is the nominee and has the most likely chance of getting the presidency, when I interviewed her and I asked her, how would you be different as a president, you know, as a woman versus a man? And she said that she would govern differently as a woman because the sum of her experiences, the sum total of her life experiences are completely different than a man's. And so her priorities are different than a man's. And she has, you know, struggled with childcare while, like, you know, she was a partner at a law firm and the primary breadwinner while her husband was a civil servant out campaigning all the time. I mean, she's been through these experiences, and she, you know, she has said publicly on the campaign trail that she's going to make half of her cabinet women. I know that they're looking to try to make at least have some, you know, approaching 50% of her appointees women. So already she's going to bring in a huge number of women into the public sector. And then she, you know, she also said that she would do a public-private partnership along the lines of what Australia has been doing to bring women into the private sector, because she's convinced that the way, you know, to sort of solve our economic shortfalls and our gaps, you know, if we bring women into the workforce in America, we'll increase our GDP by 5%, which is huge. And so this is her priority. And so, I mean, it is already very different than any other male nominee for president.
What do you say to women who want to not fall into the trap of talking about appearance and dress when they're together?
About other women or about each other?
Just, you know, it's women get together and suddenly we're all talking about our shoes, even though we don't care.
Well, I mean, that's like, I don't know. I mean, that's authentically us, right? Like, men get together and they talk about sports, women get together and they talk. I mean, so, like, you know, I don't think that it's bad to do these things. I mean, that's what women like to do. That's what you should do. You shouldn't feel like you should be shamed for doing that, right? Like, Christine Quinn, who was one of the people I interviewed for the book, who ran for mayor of New York. She was speaker of the city council. She talked a lot about how, you know, in her speeches, it was part of her economic development program for New York to get her hair done as much as she did, which I don't know if you've ever seen Christine Quinn, but she has this red short bob that is a color that is not natural at all. But she had this gay hairdresser who she absolutely loved, and she talked a lot about how much it was like one of her favorite things. Now, she had the New York Times and a bunch of, you know, press people used to ask her to do interviews about her hair, and she was like, "Oh my God, that's so sexist. You would never ask Bill de Blasio to write about his hair, right?"
But that's all we talk about with Donald Trump, is everybody's talking about his hair, you know, like, sort of.
That's true. So, I mean, but she did say, like, look, Christine didn't win her primary in part because she was perceived as too tough, which for the city of New York is kind of stunning, right? Like, I mean, this is a city that's like elected like Ed Koch and Rudy Giuliani, you know, and so she regretted not doing the piece about her hair because it would have actually helped her, you know, be softened. And it was authentically her because she loved to get her hair done. I mean, if you don't love to get your hair done, then don't talk about your hair. But if you authentically love that, then be authentic. And that's, I think the biggest lesson for parity for women is just be yourself and try to be accepted to being yourself, and don't try to like talk sports with the guys if you don't like sports. You know what I mean? And if you love to talk about your shoes, talk about your shoes. But like, just be it. That's it.
I look forward to reading your book. You're going to be signing them out in the cafeteria, so everybody can join you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.